Go find another table. This one's for real family." My daughter Victoria's voice cut through the elegant dining room of Belmont Steakhouse like a blade. Laughter rippled around the table. My mother Patricia, my son-in-law David, even Victoria's brother Michael, all nodding in agreement as if I were the punchline to some cruel joke. I stood there clutching my purse, my 67-year-old hands trembling as other diners turned to stare. The chandeliers cast warm light on crystal glasses and white tablecloths, but I felt invisible. "My name is Rachel Miller. I raised this family for 43 years. I trusted them with my life." "Sit down, Mom," Victoria said with that practiced smile. "But you're paying tonight. You're always taking from this family. Time to contribute." The waiter placed the check directly in front of me. $3,270. More than twice my monthly Social Security payment. "I can't afford this," I whispered. "Sure you can," Victoria replied sweetly. "Your Social Security just hit, didn't it?" I signed the receipt with shaking hands. $3,924 with tip. But then, across the restaurant, I noticed an elderly woman watching us with sharp, knowing eyes. And everything was about to change. If you're hearing this story, tell me in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? Before we begin today's story, please don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button. Now let's get started. The morning sun filtered through cream-colored blinds, casting thin golden lines across Rachel Miller's small kitchen table. She sat in the same chair she'd occupied every morning for 23 years. 7:30 on the dot. Her fingertips traced the familiar ridges of her weekly pill organizer, each compartment labeled in her careful handwriting. Monday through Sunday, every day accounted for. Blood pressure medication first, always first. The small white tablet rolled slightly on her palm before she placed it on her tongue. Water from the same blue ceramic mug she'd used since Richard died. The pill organizer's lid snapped shut with a precise click that seemed to echo longer than usual in the quiet condo. Her Medicare card lay beside the coffee mug, its red, white, and blue colors slightly faded from countless doctor visits. The plastic corners had softened over the years, worn smooth by anxious fingers in waiting rooms. Rachel slid it back into her brown leather wallet. The wallet itself told a story purchased in 1998 at Macy's with Richard for their anniversary trip to San Diego. The leather had darkened to a rich mahogany, polished by time and touch. Outside her window, Scottsdale woke up in layers. Mrs. Chen's sprinkler system clicked to life with its familiar mechanical rhythm. Water droplets caught the early sunlight, creating brief rainbow prisms against the glass. A car door slammed somewhere in the parking lot, followed by the soft purr of an engine pulling away. Someone was already heading to work, to family, to a life that required them elsewhere. But inside Unit 247, silence ruled everything. Rachel's one-bedroom condo held 23 years of careful living. Every bill paid by the 15th of each month. Groceries bought with coupons, organized by store sales. Medicine taken exactly as prescribed. Each choice weighed against her fixed income, measured twice before any commitment. The apartment itself reflected this careful attention. Furniture from the late 90s, still good, still functional. Cream-colored walls because they showed dirt less than white. A single bookshelf filled with large print novels from the library. The thermostat set to 72 degrees, never higher, never lower. This was her world. Small, predictable, safe. The mail had arrived early today. Through her front window, she could see the postal truck moving down Camelback Street, its engine growing fainter with each house it passed. Rachel gathered her terry cloth robe closer and padded to the front door in her worn slippers. The Arizona morning air carried hints of desert sage and distant coffee from the Starbucks across the street. 3 pieces of mail waited in her slot. A utility bill, a pharmacy reminder, and something else. Heavy cream paper. Expensive. The kind used for weddings or important announcements. Rachel carried the mail back to her kitchen table, her bare feet silent on the cool linoleum. She set the bills aside without opening them. They could wait until after breakfast. But the cream envelope demanded attention. Her name was written across the front in elegant script. Mrs. Rachel Miller. Not just Rachel, not Mom. Mrs. Rachel Miller, as if she were a stranger receiving formal correspondence. She turned the envelope over. The return address made her chest tighten slightly. Victoria Chen Miller. Her daughter. Rachel hadn't heard from Victoria in months. Not since the awkward phone call about Mother's Day, when Victoria had explained she'd be too busy with work to visit. You understand, Mom. The real estate market is crazy right now. She understood. She always understood. With careful fingers, Rachel opened the envelope. The invitation card inside matched the cream paper, embossed with gold lettering that caught the morning light. A family dinner. Belmont Steakhouse. Celebrating Victoria. Saturday, 6:30 p.m. Rachel read the words twice. Then a third time. A family dinner. She hadn't been invited to a family gathering in over 2 years. The last time had been Christmas dinner at Patricia's house, her mother-in-law, who still insisted on hosting holiday meals at 78. That evening had ended with Rachel washing dishes alone while everyone else watched football in the living room. But this was different. This was an invitation. On expensive paper. With her name written in careful script. Celebrating Victoria. Rachel wondered what they were celebrating. A promotion, perhaps. Victoria sold luxury homes in Paradise Valley, the kind of properties that came with infinity pools and wine cellars. She'd always been ambitious, even as a child. Always reaching for something bigger, something better than what they had. Maybe this time would be different. Maybe Victoria wanted to share good news with her mother. Maybe the distance of the past few years had just been about busy schedules and different priorities. Maybe I'm still family. The thought came quietly, almost whispered in her mind. Rachel set the invitation on the table and stared at it. The gold lettering seemed to shimmer in the morning light streaming through her blinds. She tried to remember the last time someone had wanted to celebrate anything with her. Richard's retirement party, maybe. But that was 8 years ago, before the stroke, before everything changed. Before she learned what it meant to be truly alone. Rachel stood and walked to her bedroom. In the top drawer of her dresser, beneath folded sweaters that smelled of lavender sachets, she kept her good jewelry. The pearl necklace Richard had given her for their 20th anniversary. The silver bracelet from Victoria's college graduation. Pieces she rarely wore now because there was nowhere special to go. She lifted the pearl necklace and held it up to the morning light. The pearls were real, cultured in Japan, according to the jeweler who'd helped Richard pick them out. They felt smooth and cool against her palm. When was the last time she'd worn pearls? When was the last time she'd dressed up for anything? The questions made her feel suddenly lighter. Maybe it was time. Maybe this dinner was exactly what she'd been waiting for without realizing it. Rachel returned to the kitchen and propped the invitation against her coffee mug. Every time she glanced up from her toast and jam, the gold lettering caught her eye like a small promise. Celebrating Victoria. She would need to buy something new to wear. Something appropriate for Belmont Steakhouse, which she knew by reputation as one of the finest restaurants in Scottsdale. Victoria had good taste. She always chose the best places, the most elegant settings. Rachel finished her breakfast and began planning her day. A trip to Dillard's, perhaps. She hadn't bought new clothes in months, but this was special. This was worth the expense. As she cleared her dishes, she noticed the stack of mail she'd set aside earlier. The utility bill could wait. The pharmacy reminder was just routine. But beneath those, she spotted something else that had gotten mixed in with the day's delivery. A Social Security Administration envelope. Official business. The kind that usually contained benefit statements or policy updates. Rachel picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The envelope was sealed, waiting to be opened. But something made her pause. A feeling she couldn't quite name. Uncertainty, maybe. Or caution that had become habit over the years. She set the envelope back on the table, unopened. Whatever was inside could wait. Today was about the invitation. Today was about hope. But as Rachel moved through her morning routine, showering, dressing, organizing her purse for the trip to Dillard's, she kept glancing at that unopened envelope. It sat on her kitchen table like a question she wasn't ready to answer. The Arizona sun climbed higher, streaming through her windows with desert intensity. The apartment grew warmer despite the air conditioning. Rachel adjusted the thermostat down 1 degree, then immediately adjusted it back. 72 was fine. 72 had always been fine. She gathered her keys, her wallet, her shopping list written in careful handwriting. The invitation to Victoria's dinner went into her purse as well, tucked safely in the side pocket where she could touch it if she needed reassurance. But the Social Security envelope remained on the table. As Rachel locked her front door and walked toward her 2015 Honda Civic in the parking lot, something nagged at the back of her mind. A feeling that had become familiar over the past few years, though she'd never quite put a name to it. Hope always came with a warning. The thought arrived unbidden as she started her car and pulled out of the Desert Palms complex. In her rearview mirror, she could see her apartment building growing smaller. Unit 247, second floor, cream-colored blinds closed against the Arizona heat. Inside, on her kitchen table, the unopened envelope waited. Saturday morning arrived with the sound of lawn mowers and children's voices drifting from the community pool. Rachel stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the collar of her new navy dress. The shopping trip to Dillard's had been successful, a classic. A line that skimmed her knees, appropriate for Belmont Steakhouse, appropriate for celebrating Victoria. The pearls felt familiar against her throat, their weight a gentle reminder of better times. Rachel touched them briefly, then checked her small purse one final time. Wallet, keys, tissues, and the invitation tucked safely in the side pocket. She'd decided to arrive early at Victoria's house. Maybe they could drive to the restaurant together, catch up during the 20-minute ride through Paradise Valley. Maybe Victoria would explain what they were celebrating, share the good news that had prompted this unexpected dinner invitation. The drive to Victoria's neighborhood took Rachel through parts of Scottsdale she rarely visited anymore. Mansion after mansion lined the wide streets, each property more elaborate than the last. Circular driveways, fountain entrances, walls that hid acres of manicured desert landscaping. This was where Victoria had chosen to build her life, far from the modest condo where Rachel counted pills each morning. Victoria's house sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, its Spanish tile roof gleaming in the afternoon sun. The driveway could hold 6 cars easily. Today, it held 3: Victoria's white BMW, her husband David's black Mercedes, and Patricia's silver Lexus. Rachel parked behind the Lexus and gathered her purse. The front door was heavy wood with iron fixtures, the kind of entrance that announced prosperity to visitors before they even stepped inside. She pressed the doorbell and heard it chime somewhere deep in the house. Footsteps approached, quick and sharp on tile floors. Victoria opened the door wearing a cream-colored blazer and dark pants. Her hair was pulled back in a perfect chignon, not a strand out of place despite the Arizona heat. She looked polished, professional, beautiful in the way that required daily maintenance and monthly salon appointments. "Mom." Victoria's smile seemed practiced. "You're early. I thought we might drive together," Rachel said. "Catch up a little." Victoria glanced over her shoulder, then stepped outside and pulled the door partially closed behind her. "Actually, that won't work. David's handling some last-minute business calls, and Patricia's helping me with seating arrangements." The dismissal was gentle but clear. Rachel felt heat rise to her cheeks, the familiar embarrassment of assuming she was welcome when she wasn't. "Of course," Rachel said. "I'll just head straight to the restaurant then." "Perfect. See you at 6:30. Victoria was already moving back toward the door when Rachel remembered something. "What are we celebrating, sweetheart? You didn't mention in the invitation." Victoria paused, her hand on the door handle. For just a moment, something flickered across her face. "Surprise, maybe. Or calculation." "It's a surprise," Victoria said finally. "You'll see tonight." The door closed with a soft click, leaving Rachel alone on the front step. Through the sidelight windows, she could see Victoria walking back toward the kitchen, her heels clicking purposefully on the tile. Rachel returned to her Honda and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine. Around her, the expensive neighborhood continued its Saturday afternoon rhythm. Gardening crews tended to elaborate landscapes. A pool service truck pulled into a driveway 2 houses down. Somewhere, a dog barked once and then fell silent. She felt foolish for suggesting they drive together. Of course Victoria had her own plans, her own schedule. Important people like Victoria didn't have time for car rides with their mothers. But something about the interaction left Rachel unsettled. The way Victoria had stepped outside instead of inviting her in. The vague answer about the celebration. The practiced quality of that smile. Rachel started her car and pulled away from the curb. In her rearview mirror, she could see Victoria's house growing smaller, its perfect facade gleaming in the desert sun. The drive back to her own neighborhood took her past the post office, the grocery store where she shopped with coupons, the medical plaza where her doctors kept offices. This was her world, practical, modest, real. By the time she reached Desert Palms, the unease had settled into something more familiar. The low-level anxiety that seemed to accompany most family interactions these days. Back in her apartment, Rachel hung her good dress carefully in the closet and changed into comfortable clothes. The dinner wasn't for another 3 hours. Time to organize her bills, maybe watch a cooking show, definitely avoid thinking about Victoria's expression when she'd mentioned the celebration. She settled at her kitchen table with the small stack of mail from yesterday. The utility bill first, always manageable, thanks to her careful thermostat habits. The pharmacy reminder went straight into the trash. She'd already picked up her prescriptions for the month. That left the Social Security envelope, still unopened from the day before. Rachel turned it over in her hands. The return address was official, printed in the standard government font that made everything look serious and slightly threatening. Inside would be her monthly benefit statement, probably. Or maybe notification of the annual cost of living adjustment. Nothing urgent, nothing that couldn't wait another day. She set it aside and focused on organizing her pill organizer for the upcoming week. Monday through Sunday, each compartment filled with precision. Blood pressure medication, cholesterol management, the calcium supplement her doctor had recommended. Simple routines that kept her healthy, kept her independent. The kitchen clock above her stove ticked steadily toward 5 o'clock. Soon it would be time to get ready again, to put on the navy dress and pearls and drive to Belmont Steakhouse. To sit at a table with her family and celebrate whatever Victoria wanted to celebrate. Rachel tried to summon excitement about the evening ahead. A nice restaurant, good food, time with people who mattered to her. But the unease lingered, a feeling she couldn't quite name or dismiss. The Social Security envelope seemed to watch her from its spot on the table. Official business, waiting patiently for attention. Instead, Rachel picked up her phone and checked the time. 5:15. If she left at 6, she'd arrive exactly on time. Not early, not late. Perfectly appropriate. She returned to her bedroom and began the careful process of getting ready. The navy dress looked elegant in the full-length mirror. The pearls caught the light just right. Her makeup was subtle but polished, appropriate for a woman of 67 attending a family celebration. By 6 o'clock, she was ready. Purse organized, keys in hand, directions to Belmont Steakhouse programmed into her phone's GPS. Everything perfect. Except for the feeling that something wasn't right. Rachel locked her apartment door and walked to her car. The evening air carried hints of cooling desert, the promise of another beautiful Arizona night. In a few hours, this uncertainty would be resolved. She'd understand what they were celebrating, why she'd been invited, what role she was meant to play in Victoria's announcement. But as she started her Honda and pulled out of the Desert Palms parking lot, one thought kept circling through her mind: Victoria's expression when she'd asked about the celebration. That moment of calculation before the practiced answer. It's a surprise. You'll see tonight. Some surprises, Rachel knew, weren't always pleasant. The Social Security envelope remained on her kitchen table, sealed and forgotten in the gathering dusk of her empty apartment. 20 minutes later, Rachel stood in front of Belmont Steakhouse, watching well-dressed couples disappear through the heavy glass doors. The restaurant occupied a corner building in Old Town Scottsdale, its exterior all warm stone and elegant lighting. Valet attendants moved between expensive cars with practiced efficiency. This wasn't Rachel's world. The prices here probably exceeded her monthly grocery budget for a single meal. But Victoria had chosen this place, had wanted to celebrate here, and Rachel would find a way to manage whatever the evening cost. Inside, the restaurant hummed with quiet conversation and the subtle sounds of fine dining. Crystal glasses caught light from chandeliers. Servers moved between tables with silver trays balanced perfectly in their hands. Everything spoke of luxury, of celebration, of special occasions that required special places. The hostess, a young woman with glossy black hair and a practiced smile, checked her reservation list. "Miller party?" Rachel asked. "Right this way, ma'am." The dining room stretched out in elegant curves, each table set with white linens and fresh flowers. The hostess led Rachel toward a large table near the back, where familiar figures were already seated. Victoria sat at the head of the table. Her cream blazer exchanged for a black cocktail dress that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly Social Security check. David was beside her, checking his phone with the distracted air of someone always conducting business. Patricia occupied the seat to Victoria's right, her silver hair perfectly styled, her posture reflecting decades of conscious elegance. And there were others. Rachel recognized some faces from previous family gatherings: Victoria's brother Michael and his wife Susan, a couple from David's business world whose names she'd forgotten. 8 people total, all dressed for celebration. All except the empty chair at the far end of the table. "Mom," Victoria called out with that same practiced smile. Perfect timing. Rachel approached the table, suddenly conscious of every eye tracking her movement. Her navy dress felt plain compared to Victoria's cocktail attire. Her pearls seemed modest next to Susan's elaborate necklace. "Where should I sit?" Rachel asked. Victoria gestured toward the empty chair. "Right there. We saved you a spot." The seat was isolated at the opposite end from Victoria, with empty space on both sides. Not beside her daughter, not part of the inner circle of conversation. A chair for someone who was included but separate. Rachel sat down and unfolded her napkin. Around her, conversation resumed: business deals, vacation plans, mutual acquaintances she didn't recognize. She smiled when appropriate, nodded at jokes she didn't quite catch, tried to project the appearance of someone who belonged. The server approached with water glasses and menus bound in leather. Rachel opened hers and felt her stomach drop slightly. Appetizers started at $28. Steaks began at $55 and climbed from there. The wine list occupied its own section, with bottles priced higher than her monthly car payment. "The lobster tail is excellent here," Patricia said to the table in general. "And the Wagyu beef is supposed to be exceptional." Murmurs of agreement circled the table. Rachel studied her menu and tried to identify something reasonably priced. A chicken dish, perhaps. Or pasta, if they had anything simple. "So what exactly are we celebrating?" Michael asked, raising his water glass. "Victoria's been mysterious about the whole thing." Victoria stood slightly, commanding attention with the grace of someone accustomed to being the center of focus. "Actually," she said, "it's better to order first. Then we can really enjoy the announcement." More anticipation. Rachel found herself caught up in the excitement despite her unease. Maybe Victoria had gotten a promotion, landed a major client, bought an even bigger house in Paradise Valley. The server returned to take drink orders. Wine flowed freely, a bottle of something French that cost $87, according to the list. Rachel declined and stuck with water. Appetizers arrived next. Oysters on the half-shell, seared foie gras, something involving truffle oil that smelled incredibly rich. Rachel hadn't ordered an appetizer, but she watched the others enjoy their selections with obvious pleasure. Then came the main courses. Lobster tails the size of her fist. Steaks that looked like works of art. Duck prepared in a style she'd never heard of, accompanied by vegetables arranged like small sculptures. Rachel had ordered the least expensive item she could find, a chicken breast with seasonal vegetables, for $34. It was delicious, probably the best chicken she'd ever tasted, but she could barely concentrate on eating. The numbers kept adding up in her head. 8 people, expensive appetizers, premium main courses, multiple bottles of wine. The total was going to be staggering. "Now," Victoria said as the servers cleared the main course plates. "The celebration." She remained standing while everyone else settled back in their chairs. The restaurant's soft lighting caught the highlights in her hair, the careful makeup that enhanced her already striking features. She looked successful, confident, completely in control. "David and I have some news," Victoria began. "We've been selected to handle the exclusive listing for the Phoenician Estates development. $20 million properties, international buyers, the biggest real estate project in Arizona this decade." Applause rippled around the table. David stood and put his arm around Victoria's waist, both of them beaming with the satisfaction of significant achievement. "It's a 2-year project," Victoria continued. "Commissions in the 7 figures. We're talking about opening a satellite office, maybe expanding into California markets." More applause. Wine glasses raised in toasts. Congratulations exchanged with the enthusiasm of people who understood the significance of such success. Rachel clapped along with the others, genuinely happy for her daughter. This was wonderful news, the kind of opportunity that could set Victoria and David up for life. No wonder they'd chosen Belmont Steakhouse for the announcement. This deserved celebration. But then Victoria's expression shifted slightly. The warm smile became something sharper, more calculating. Of course, Victoria said, still standing, success like this requires investment. Office space, marketing, entertainment for potential clients. And family should support family in moments like this. The table fell quiet. Rachel felt a change in the atmosphere, subtle but unmistakable. As if everyone else knew something she didn't. Victoria looked directly at Rachel for the first time that evening. Which is why we thought tonight would be perfect for you to contribute to our success, Mom. A family investment in our future. Rachel felt her chest tighten slightly. I don't understand. Just dinner, Victoria said with that practiced smile. Your treat. Your way of celebrating with us and showing your support for this new venture. The words seemed to echo in Rachel's head. Your treat. The enormous meal, the expensive wines, the celebration that had nothing to do with her but everything to do with her credit card. Rachel looked around the table. 8 people, all watching her with varying degrees of expectation and amusement. Patricia's expression was particularly telling, a mixture of satisfaction and something that looked suspiciously like contempt. I don't think I can afford, Rachel began. Oh, Mom, Victoria interrupted with a laugh that sounded forced. Don't be so dramatic. Your Social Security just hit, didn't it? And you never spend money on anything fun. This is your chance to be part of something important. The server appeared at Rachel's elbow as if summoned by invisible signal. In his hands was a black leather folder, the check. He placed it directly in front of Rachel. She opened the folder with trembling fingers and felt the world tilt slightly. The total, printed in elegant script at the bottom of the itemized bill, was $3,270. $3,270. More than twice her monthly Social Security payment. More than she spent on groceries in 6 months. More than she had in her checking account without dipping into the small savings she'd managed to accumulate over the years. Rachel stared at the number until it blurred slightly. Around her, conversation resumed as if nothing significant had happened. Michael was telling a story about a golf game. Susan was showing Patricia photos on her phone. David was back to checking his messages. Only Victoria continued to watch her, waiting. I can't afford this, Rachel said quietly. Sure you can, Victoria replied, her voice carrying just enough volume for the table to hear. You're always complaining that we never include you in family things. Well, here's your chance to actually participate instead of just taking. The word, taking, hung in the air like an accusation. Rachel felt heat rise to her cheeks, the familiar shame of being found wanting in her daughter's eyes. I never asked to take anything, she said. Right, Victoria said with another forced laugh. The woman who calls every month asking for help with her bills never asks for anything. Rachel's hands shook slightly as she reached for her purse. She couldn't remember the last time she'd asked Victoria for money. Maybe once, 2 years ago, when her car had needed unexpected repairs. But that had been an emergency, and she'd paid it back within 3 months. Her credit card felt thin between her fingers. The same card she used for groceries, for gas, for her prescription medications. The card tied to her Medicare account for automatic payments. The server stood patiently beside the table, his expression professionally neutral. Around them, the restaurant continued its elegant symphony of fine dining. Other families celebrated other achievements, probably with joy instead of this cold transaction. Rachel placed her credit card in the black folder. Thank you, Victoria said, settling back into her chair. See how easy that was? As the server walked away with her credit card, Rachel felt something break inside her chest. Not anger, exactly. Not sadness. Something more final. She realized that this hadn't been about celebration at all. This had been about her role in the family, not daughter, not mother, not even guest. She was the person who absorbed the costs, who paid without questioning, who was supposed to be grateful for the privilege of being included. The credit card returned 5 minutes later with a receipt to sign. Rachel added a 20% tip because that's what Victoria would expect, what would be appropriate at a restaurant like this. The final total was $3,924. Her monthly Social Security check was $1,847. As she signed her name at the bottom of the receipt, Rachel caught Victoria watching her with an expression of satisfied calculation. This had been planned. The expensive restaurant, the family audience, the timing with her Social Security payment. All of it designed to extract maximum payment with minimum resistance. Perfect, Victoria said as Rachel tucked the receipt into her purse. Now, doesn't it feel good to contribute to something important? Around the table, conversation flowed on as if nothing significant had happened. Plans for the new business venture, speculation about commission potential, discussion of vacation properties in California. Rachel sat in her isolated chair at the end of the table and realized that she'd become invisible. Her function paying the bill had been completed. Now she was simply furniture, taking up space until someone decided the evening was over. She looked down at her hands, folded carefully in her lap. The wedding ring Richard had placed there 31 years ago caught the restaurant's soft lighting. He would have been horrified by tonight, would have confronted Victoria immediately, would have protected Rachel from this humiliation. But Richard was gone, and Rachel was alone at a table full of family who saw her as a resource to be managed rather than a person to be loved. The evening wasn't over, but for Rachel, it had ended the moment she signed that receipt. Everything else would just be waiting for permission to leave. The drive home from Belmont Steakhouse felt longer than the 20 minutes Rachel's GPS indicated. She kept the radio off, preferring the silence to any cheerful music that might mock the hollow feeling in her chest. Desert streetlights flashed past her windows in regular intervals, marking time she couldn't get back, money she couldn't recover. $3,924. The number had burned itself into her memory during the awkward goodbyes outside the restaurant. Victoria had hugged her with the same practiced warmth. She showed clients, thanking her for making tonight special, while already turning toward David's Mercedes. Patricia had nodded with what looked like approval, as if Rachel had finally performed her proper function in the family hierarchy. No one had offered to help with the bill. No one had even pretended surprise at its size. Back in her apartment, Rachel hung her navy dress in the closet and changed into her cotton nightgown. The pearls went back to their velvet box in the dresser drawer, next to jewelry she rarely wore because there was nowhere special to go. She sat at her kitchen table in the same spot where she'd read Victoria's invitation 2 days earlier. The cream-colored card was still propped against her coffee mug, its gold lettering now seeming to mock her with promises of family celebration. Celebrating Victoria. Rachel had celebrated, all right. With money she couldn't afford, at a restaurant chosen specifically for its expense. Surrounded by people who saw her as a convenient source of funds rather than a human being deserving respect. The Social Security envelope lay exactly where she'd left it yesterday morning. Still unopened, still waiting for attention she hadn't been willing to give. Maybe because some part of her had suspected what tonight might cost. With careful fingers, Rachel opened the envelope and spread its contents on her table. Her monthly benefit statement looked normal at first glance. The familiar format, the official letterhead, her name printed clearly at the top. But as she read through the details, something made her pause. Direct deposits for the month $1,847. But there was another line item she hadn't noticed before. A deduction section that showed automatic withdrawals from her account. Medicare premium $164.90. Supplemental insurance $89.50. Family financial management service $420. Rachel stared at the last line. Family financial management service. She'd never heard of such a thing, never authorized any service to deduct money from her Social Security payments. $420 every month. For how long? She searched through the paperwork in her desk drawer, looking for previous statements. The statements she'd been setting aside month after month, assuming they contained the same routine information they'd always contained. January statement $420 deduction. December $420 deduction. November $420 deduction. Rachel's hands began to shake as she worked backward through the statements. Every month, the same deduction. Every month, $420 disappearing from money she desperately needed. How had she not noticed? How had she been so careless with her own finances? But even as she asked herself these questions, Rachel remembered the conversations over the past few years. Victoria insisting on helping with her complicated paperwork. Patricia suggesting that Rachel was getting forgetful about financial matters. David offering to handle her Medicare enrollment because the forms were too confusing for someone her age. "We're just trying to help, Mom. You don't need to worry about all this paperwork." Rachel reached for her telephone and dialed the number on her latest statement. An automated system answered, offering options for various inquiries. She pressed 0 repeatedly until a human voice came on the line. "Social Security Administration, this is Jennifer. How can I help you?" "I need to understand a deduction from my benefits," Rachel said. "Something called Family Financial Management Service. Can I have your Social Security number, please?" Rachel provided the information and waited while Jennifer accessed her account. "I see the deduction you're asking about," Jennifer said. "That was set up as an automatic withdrawal in March of 2012. Looks like it was authorized by your designated representative for financial matters." "My what?" "Your designated representative, someone you appointed to handle financial decisions on your behalf. The authorization shows it was signed by you and witnessed by 2 family members." Rachel felt the room spin slightly. March 2012. That was just 4 months after Richard died, when she'd been drowning in paperwork and grief. When Victoria had insisted on helping with everything because Rachel was too emotional to think clearly. "Who is my designated representative?" Rachel asked. "Victoria Chen Miller. Would you like me to connect you to her for questions about the deduction?" "No," Rachel said quickly. "Can you tell me how much has been withdrawn total?" "Just a moment." Computer keys clicked in the background. Since March 2012, the total withdrawn is $60,480. The phone slipped in Rachel's hands. $60,000. More than 3 years of her Social Security benefits, taken $420 at a time while she counted pills and watched her grocery budget and lived in careful poverty. "How'd I stop this deduction?" Rachel asked. "You'll need written authorization from your designated representative, or you'll need to petition to have your representative status changed. That requires a formal review process." "How long does that take?" 6 to 8 months, typically. "And you'll need documentation showing why the change is necessary." Rachel hung up the phone and stared at the statements spread across her table. 12 years of theft, disguised as family assistance. 12 years of Victoria and Patricia and David extracting $420 every month while watching her struggle with basic expenses. The dinner tonight hadn't been about celebration. It had been about reminding her of her place in the family ecosystem. The person who paid, who absorbed costs, who was grateful for whatever scraps of inclusion they offered. But $60,480 wasn't scraps. It was systematic financial exploitation, conducted with legal paperwork and family authority. While Rachel mourned her husband and trusted the people who claimed to love her, she thought about the times she'd called Victoria for small emergencies. The month when her air conditioning had broken and she'd asked for help with the repair bill. The Christmas when she'd apologized for not buying better gifts because her Social Security didn't go as far as it used to. Victoria had listened to those conversations knowing she was stealing $420 every month. Had probably felt frustrated that Rachel dared ask for help when so much money was already being extracted from her account. Rachel gathered the statements and put them in a folder. Tomorrow, she would call a lawyer. Tonight, she would sit with the knowledge that her family had been robbing her for 12 years while treating her like a burden they generously tolerated. The apartment felt different now. Not safe and controlled, but small and isolated. A place where an elderly woman lived alone, unaware that the people she trusted most were systematically destroying her financial security. Outside her window, Scottsdale continued its night rhythm. Cars passing on distant streets, the hum of air conditioning units fighting the desert heat, the far-off sound of music from someone's weekend celebration. Rachel made herself a cup of tea and sat back down at her kitchen table. The invitation to Victoria's dinner seemed pathetic now. An expensive piece of paper that had cost her nearly $4,000 and whatever remained of her illusions about family loyalty. She thought about Richard, about what he would say if he knew. The fury he would feel, the protection he would provide, the way he would confront Victoria and demand immediate restitution. But Richard was gone, and Rachel was 77 years old with no one to protect her except herself. For the first time in 12 years, that might have to be enough. The tea grew cold as Rachel sat in her kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of her family's betrayal and the weight of decisions she would have to make alone. Outside, the Arizona night stretched endless and dark, full of possibilities she hadn't yet learned to imagine. 3 days later, Rachel stood in the lobby of Goldberg and Associates, a law firm specializing in elder abuse that she'd found through an internet search at the public library. The office occupied the second floor of a modest building in downtown Phoenix, far from the luxury addresses where Victoria conducted her real estate business. Margaret Goldberg was younger than Rachel had expected, maybe 50, with gray-streaked hair and the kind of direct gaze that suggested she'd seen every variation of family financial exploitation. Her office was functional rather than elegant, filled with legal books and case files that spoke of serious work rather than prestigious clients. "Tell me what happened," Margaret said after Rachel had settled into the chair across from her desk. Rachel spread the Social Security statements across Margaret's desk, 12 years of evidence organized chronologically. The story came out in careful detail: Richard's death, Victoria's offer to help with paperwork, the gradual realization that help had become theft. Margaret studied the documents with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen similar cases many times before. $60,000 over 12 years, she said finally. "And this was set up how long after your husband died?" 4 months, Rachel said. "I was still having trouble sleeping, still crying at random moments. Victoria said the paperwork was too complicated, that I might make mistakes that would affect my benefits." "Classic timing," Margaret said grimly. "Predators wait for moments of vulnerability. Death of a spouse, medical crisis, any time when the victim is emotionally compromised and likely to accept help without questioning the details." The word, predators, made Rachel flinch. This was her daughter they were discussing, not some stranger who'd targeted her for fraud. But the evidence was spread across Margaret's desk in black and white, 12 years of systematic theft disguised as family assistance. "What are my options?" Rachel asked. Margaret leaned back in her chair. "Several, but none of them easy. We can file for immediate cessation of the withdrawals, petition to have your financial representative status changed, and pursue civil action for restitution of stolen funds." "How long will that take?" 6 months minimum for the administrative changes. Another year or more for civil litigation. And there's no guarantee your family will have assets sufficient to cover full restitution. Especially if they've been living beyond their means using your money. Rachel thought about Victoria's house in Paradise Valley, the expensive cars, the designer clothes, the celebration dinner at Belmont Steakhouse. How much of that lifestyle had been funded by $420 monthly withdrawals from an elderly mother's Social Security account? "There's also the criminal angle," Margaret continued. "Financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult is a felony in Arizona. If the district attorney decides to pursue charges, your family could face significant jail time." "I don't want them to go to prison," Rachel said quickly. "I just want my money back and for the theft to stop." Margaret nodded. "That's understandable. Many victims feel conflicted about prosecuting family members. But you need to understand that your family has committed serious crimes. They've stolen over $60,000 from you while watching you struggle financially. They've used legal documents to give their theft an appearance of legitimacy. This isn't a misunderstanding or poor judgment. This is calculated exploitation." Rachel stared at the statements on Margaret's desk. Calculated exploitation. The legal term made Victoria's actions sound more serious than family conflict, more significant than the embarrassment she'd felt at dinner 3 nights ago. "What happens next?" she asked. "We file emergency petitions to stop the withdrawals immediately. Then we gather evidence for the civil case: bank records, financial statements, documentation of their lifestyle improvements during the period when they were stealing from you. We'll also need to establish that you were not mentally incapacitated when you supposedly authorized these withdrawals." "I wasn't," Rachel said. "Grieving, yes. Confused about some things, certainly. But I never would have agreed to give them $400 every month if I'd understood what I was signing." "Do you remember signing anything?" Rachel closed her eyes and tried to recall those difficult months after Richard's death. Victoria had brought so many documents to her apartment. Social Security paperwork, Medicare forms, insurance claims, financial statements that needed updating. Just sign here, Mom. And here. This is routine stuff, updating your address, changing the beneficiary information now that Dad is gone. She brought me a stack of papers, Rachel said slowly. Said they were routine updates because of Richard's death. I signed whatever she put in front of me because I trusted her. Classic technique, Margaret said. Bury the important document in a stack of legitimate paperwork. The victim signs everything without reading carefully because they trust the person who's supposedly helping them. Rachel felt a new wave of humiliation wash over her. Not just for being robbed, but for being so predictably, easily manipulated. For being exactly the kind of vulnerable elderly person who made an easy target for financial exploitation. It's not your fault, Margaret said, reading her expression. You were grieving, isolated, and approached by someone you had every reason to trust. The predator is always responsible for exploitation, not the victim. But as Rachel gathered the statements and prepared to leave Margaret's office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she should have been more careful, more suspicious, more protected against the people who claimed to love her. The drive home took her through neighborhoods she'd driven through for 23 years. But something fundamental had changed in the past week. The familiar streets looked different now, less safe, more uncertain. She was no longer just an elderly woman living independently in a nice retirement community. She was a victim of financial exploitation, someone whose own family had systematically robbed her. While she counted pills and watched her budget and apologized for not buying better Christmas presents. Back in her apartment, Rachel made tea and sat at her kitchen table. Tomorrow, Margaret would file the emergency petitions. Within a week, the $420 monthly withdrawals would stop. Within a month, Victoria would receive legal notification that her financial authority had been revoked. And that she was being sued for restitution of stolen funds. Rachel imagined Victoria's reaction to receiving those papers. The surprise, the anger, the indignation that her mother would dare challenge family authority. The phone calls would start immediately, Patricia demanding to know what Rachel thought she was doing, Victoria explaining that the withdrawals had been for Rachel's own good, David. Suggesting that elderly people often become confused about financial matters. But for the first time in 12 years, Rachel wouldn't be listening to those explanations. For the first time since Richard died, she had someone on her side who understood exactly what had been done to her and how to fight back. The Social Security statements were safely filed away now, evidence in a legal case that would determine whether justice was possible for 77-year-old women, whose families saw them as resources to be managed rather than people to be loved. Outside her window, the Arizona sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Beautiful, timeless, indifferent to human cruelty and human resilience in equal measure. Rachel sipped her tea and watched darkness settle over Scottsdale. Tomorrow would bring legal battles, family confrontations, and consequences she couldn't yet imagine. But tonight, for the first time in 12 years, she felt like someone other than a victim. The phone started ringing at 7:30 the next morning. Rachel was measuring her morning pills when the shrill sound cut through the quiet of her apartment. She let it ring while she swallowed her blood pressure medication with careful sips of water. The answering machine clicked on. Victoria's voice filled the kitchen, sharp with barely controlled fury. "Mom, what the hell do you think you're doing? I just got served with legal papers claiming I stole money from you. This is absolutely ridiculous and you need to call me back immediately." The machine beeped. Rachel continued with her morning routine, checking her blood sugar, organizing her pill organizer for the week ahead. Simple tasks that felt more important than returning her daughter's call. The phone rang again at 7:45. This time it was Patricia, her voice carrying the imperious tone she'd perfected over 78 years of getting her way through sheer force of personality. "Rachel, this nonsense with lawyers needs to stop right now." Victoria called me in tears. "How dare you accuse your own family of theft? We've done nothing but help you since Richard died, and this is how you repay us. You should be ashamed of yourself." Rachel turned off the answering machine and finished her breakfast in silence. Outside her window, the Desert Palms community was waking up. Mrs. Chen watering her small garden. Mr. Rodriguez walking his elderly terrier around the parking lot. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that their neighbor was being systematically destroyed by her own family. The calls continued throughout the day. Victoria, increasingly frantic. Patricia, increasingly self-righteous. David, attempting to sound reasonable while explaining that Rachel was obviously confused about financial matters and needed to think about the family's reputation. By afternoon, Rachel had stopped answering the phone entirely. She sat in her living room, reading a library book and pretending the outside world didn't exist. But the messages kept accumulating, each one more desperate or angry than the last. At 4 o'clock, someone knocked on her door. Rachel looked through the peephole and saw Victoria standing in the hallway. Her daughter wore dark sunglasses and a black dress that probably cost more than Rachel's monthly grocery budget. Behind her stood Patricia, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the Arizona heat. They knocked again, more insistent this time. "Mom, I know you're in there," Victoria called. "We need to talk about this misunderstanding before it goes any further." Rachel unlocked the door but left the security chain attached, opening it just wide enough to see their faces clearly. "There's no misunderstanding," she said quietly. "I know what you've been doing." Victoria pushed against the door, testing the strength of the security chain. "Let us in. This is ridiculous, standing out here like strangers." "We're not strangers," Rachel replied. "Strangers wouldn't have stolen $60,000 from me." Patricia stepped closer to the door, her face flushed with indignation. "How dare you use that word? We helped you when you couldn't handle your own affairs. We protected your money from your own poor judgment. By taking $420 every month for 12 years? That was for management fees," Victoria said, her voice rising. "Do you have any idea how much time we spent dealing with your paperwork? Your Medicare claims, your insurance issues, your constant questions about every little thing? I never asked you to manage my money. You couldn't handle it yourself," Patricia snapped. "You were a wreck after Richard died. Crying all the time, forgetting to pay bills, leaving mail unopened for weeks. Someone had to take charge." Rachel felt the familiar heat of shame rising in her chest. They were right about her emotional state after Richard's death. She had been overwhelmed, confused, grateful for any help her family offered. But grief didn't justify theft. "I want the money back," Rachel said through the gap in the door. Victoria laughed, a harsh sound that echoed in the hallway. "What money? The money we spent taking care of you? The money we used to handle your affairs? You think that was free? I think it was stealing." "Fine," Victoria said, pulling her sunglasses off to reveal eyes bright with anger. "You want to play victim? You want to pretend we're criminals? Let's see how that works out for you." Patricia leaned closer to the door crack. "You'll lose, you know. No one will believe that your own family would steal from you. They'll think you're a confused old woman making accusations she can't prove. I have the Social Security statements. You have paperwork you don't understand," Patricia said coldly. "Paperwork that shows legitimate financial management services that you authorized and benefited from. Good luck proving otherwise." Victoria put her sunglasses back on and stepped away from the door. "This conversation is over. But Mom, you need to understand something. When you attack us like this, when you make false accusations and drag our names through legal proceedings, there are consequences." "What kind of consequences?" "The kind that leave you completely alone," Victoria said. "No family support. No help when you get sick. No one to check on you when you don't answer your phone for 3 days. Is $60,000 worth losing your family forever?" Rachel felt something cold settle in her stomach. The threat was clear, delivered with the casual cruelty of people who'd already decided she was disposable. "You're my family," she said weakly. "Not anymore," Victoria replied. "Not if you're going to accuse us of being thieves." They turned and walked away, their heels clicking on the hallway tiles with the sharp finality of doors closing forever. Rachel shut her door and leaned against it, her heart racing from the confrontation. The apartment felt smaller now, more isolated. Outside, the normal sounds of suburban life continued: children playing, cars starting, neighbors calling to each other across parking lots. But inside Unit 247, silence pressed down like a weight. The phone rang again at 7 o'clock. This time it was Michael, Victoria's brother, his voice carefully neutral in the way that suggested he'd been coached. Mom, I'm calling because I care about you. Victoria told me what happened, and I think there's been a misunderstanding. Rachel almost laughed at the word, misunderstanding. As if 12 years of theft could be explained away by poor communication. Have you seen the Social Security statements? She asked. I've seen paperwork that can be interpreted different ways, Michael replied. But more importantly, I've seen how this is tearing our family apart. Is that really what you want? I want my money back. Even if it costs you everyone who loves you. The question hung in the air between them. Rachel realized that Michael, like the others, had already chosen sides. The family had closed ranks against her, united in their determination to protect their reputation and their financial interests. I guess I'll find out, she said, and hung up. The next morning brought a new form of attack. Rachel opened her apartment door to get her newspaper and found Mrs. Patterson from Unit 156 standing in the hallway, her expression a mixture of concern and poorly disguised curiosity. I heard about your troubles with your family, Mrs. Patterson said. So sad when elderly people become confused about their finances. Rachel felt her chest tighten. I'm not confused. Of course not, dear. But these things happen as we age. My sister went through the same thing before we had to put her in a facility. She was convinced her son was stealing from her, when really he was just trying to help manage her affairs. This is different. Mrs. Patterson's smile was patronizing, the kind reserved for people who were clearly not thinking rationally. I'm sure it feels that way to you. But family doesn't steal from family, does it? That's just not how these things work. Rachel realized that Victoria's campaign had begun. Whispered conversations with neighbors, carefully planted suggestions that Rachel was becoming confused. Losing her mental faculties, making accusations she couldn't support. The classic strategy for discrediting elderly victims: make them appear incompetent and their accusations seem like symptoms of age-related decline. Over the next week, the campaign intensified. Other neighbors began treating Rachel with the careful sympathy reserved for people whose minds were failing. The woman at the grocery store checkout spoke more slowly and loudly than usual. The pharmacist asked twice if she understood her medication instructions. Meanwhile, the legal process ground forward with frustrating slowness. Margaret Goldberg called every few days with updates on paperwork filed, depositions scheduled, evidence gathered. But the wheels of justice turned at a pace that seemed designed to exhaust elderly plaintiffs before they could achieve resolution. These cases take time, Margaret explained during one of their meetings. Your family's attorneys are using every delay tactic available. They're hoping you'll get tired of fighting and drop the case. How long could it take? 2 years, maybe 3 if they appeal. And they're spreading rumors about your mental competence, trying to undermine your credibility as a witness. Rachel left Margaret's office feeling more isolated than ever. Her family had turned against her, her neighbors viewed her with suspicious sympathy, and the legal system moved too slowly to provide any immediate relief. But the worst was yet to come. On a Thursday afternoon in late September, Rachel's doorbell rang. She opened the door to find a woman in her 30s wearing a professional suit and carrying an official-looking folder. Mrs. Miller? I'm Sarah Chen from Adult Protective Services. We received a report of concern about your welfare. Rachel's blood ran cold. What kind of report? A family member contacted us with concerns about your mental state and your ability to live independently. They're worried about your safety and your decision-making capacity. Who made the report? Sarah consulted her folder. Victoria Chen Miller, your daughter. She says you've been making false accusations against family members, becoming increasingly paranoid, and showing signs of dementia. The room seemed to tilt around Rachel. This was the final attack, the ultimate weapon in Victoria's campaign to destroy her credibility and regain control of her finances. An Adult Protective Services investigation that could result in Rachel being declared incompetent and placed under state guardianship. I'm not paranoid, Rachel said carefully. And I'm not showing signs of dementia. I'm pursuing legal action against family members who stole money from me. Sarah's expression was professionally sympathetic. I understand that's how you perceive the situation. But family members are concerned that you're not able to make rational decisions about your finances or your living situation. What happens next? We'll need to conduct an assessment. Interview you, review your living situation, possibly arrange for cognitive testing. If we determine that you're unable to care for yourself safely, we'll recommend appropriate interventions. Rachel knew what those interventions could include: loss of financial autonomy, forced relocation to assisted living, appointment of a state guardian who would control every aspect of her remaining life. The very outcomes Victoria had threatened when Rachel first discovered the theft. After Sarah left, Rachel sat in her living room and stared at the walls she'd painted herself when she first moved in 23 years ago. Cream-colored because they showed dirt less than white. Practical, careful, designed to last. Everything in her life had been designed to last, to provide security and independence in her old age. But her own family had systematically destroyed that security while she trusted them to protect it. Now they were trying to finish the job by having her declared incompetent. Rachel walked to her bedroom and looked at herself in the full-length mirror. A 77-year-old woman with silver hair and tired eyes, wearing a cotton house dress and slippers that had seen better years. She looked exactly like what she was: an elderly person living alone, vulnerable to anyone who wanted to take advantage of her trust. But appearances could be deceiving. Rachel returned to her living room and picked up the telephone. She dialed Margaret Goldberg's number from memory. "Margaret, it's Rachel Miller. Victoria has filed a report with Adult Protective Services claiming I'm incompetent." "Standard tactic," Margaret said grimly. "They're trying to discredit you before the civil case goes to trial. How do you want to handle this?" For the first time in months, Rachel didn't hesitate. "I want to fight," she said. "I want to fight everything they've done and everything they're trying to do. I don't care how long it takes or how much it costs or who turns against me. They stole my money and now they're trying to steal my freedom. I won't let that happen." Margaret was quiet for a moment. "That's going to be a difficult path. Your family has resources, connections, and they're willing to destroy your reputation to protect themselves. Are you prepared for how ugly this could get?" Rachel looked around her small apartment, at the life she'd built through careful choices and modest dreams. At the independence she'd maintained for 23 years through discipline and frugality and the absolute trust that family meant safety. That trust had been her greatest mistake. But it wouldn't be her final one. "They already made it ugly," Rachel said. "Now I'm going to make it expensive." She hung up the phone and walked to her kitchen window. Outside, the Arizona afternoon blazed with desert heat that could kill the unprepared but sustain those who understood how to survive it. Rachel had survived Richard's death, 12 years of financial theft, family betrayal, and community suspicion. She had discovered reservoirs of strength she hadn't known existed, legal options she'd never considered, and a capacity for righteous anger that surprised even her. Victoria had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that an elderly woman living alone would eventually surrender rather than fight. She'd counted on Rachel's fear of isolation, her need for family approval, her ingrained habit of avoiding conflict. But some things were worth fighting for, regardless of the cost. Rachel made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table. Tomorrow would bring new battles: Adult Protective Services interviews, legal depositions, probably more attempts to undermine her credibility and resolve. But tonight, she felt something she hadn't experienced in 12 years. She felt dangerous. The woman who had paid $3,924 for dinner without protest was gone. In her place sat someone who understood exactly what her family was and what they were capable of. Someone who had nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to fear. The desert sunset painted her kitchen walls in brilliant oranges and reds. The colors of fire and determination and the kind of beauty that emerged from harsh conditions. Rachel sipped her tea and planned her counterattack. The Adult Protective Services interview took place in Rachel's living room on a Tuesday morning that felt like Judgment Day. Sarah Chen returned with a colleague, Drive. Marcus Webb, whose title was Geriatric Assessment Specialist, and whose job was to determine whether Rachel Miller possessed the mental capacity to live independently. Rachel had prepared for this moment like a final exam. She'd organized her financial documents, written a timeline of the theft with supporting evidence, and practiced explaining her situation in clear, rational terms that couldn't be dismissed as paranoid delusions. But as Dr. Webb unpacked his assessment materials and Sarah arranged her interview forms on the coffee table, Rachel felt the weight of what was at stake. One unfavorable report could strip away her independence forever, regardless of what Victoria had stolen or how many laws had been broken. Mrs. Miller, drive. Webb began, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone trained to work with potentially confused elderly patients. I understand there's been some family conflict about financial matters. Not conflict, Rachel corrected. Theft. Systematic theft disguised as financial management. Sarah made a note on her clipboard. Your daughter expressed concern that you've become suspicious of people trying to help you. She says you've been accusing family members of stealing money that was actually being used to pay for services you authorized. Rachel reached for the folder she'd prepared. Inside were copies of every Social Security statement from the past 12 years, highlighted to show the unauthorized deductions. Bank records. The original petition for financial representative status that she'd obtained through Margaret Goldberg's office. I authorized nothing, Rachel said, spreading the documents across her coffee table. In March 2012, 4 months after my husband died, Victoria brought me a stack of papers she said were routine updates. I signed them while I was grieving, trusting her to handle details I was too emotional to process properly. Dr. Webb studied the paperwork with professional interest. This shows systematic withdrawals of $420 monthly for 12 years. What was your understanding of these withdrawals when they began? I had no understanding of them because I wasn't told they existed. Victoria handled my Social Security paperwork. She told me the forms were for updating my address and beneficiary information after Richard's death. Sarah leaned forward. But you continued to receive benefit statements showing these deductions. Didn't you notice the reduced amounts? Rachel felt the familiar heat of shame, but pushed through it. I trusted my daughter to handle financial complications I didn't understand. When my Social Security seemed low, she explained that Medicare costs had increased or that I was remembering the amounts incorrectly. She was my financial representative. I believed her explanations. That suggests a certain level of cognitive impairment, drive. Webb said gently. Difficulty tracking finances, confusion about amounts, reliance on others for basic financial decisions. No, Rachel said firmly. It suggests a grieving widow who trusted her daughter not to steal from her. There's a difference between emotional vulnerability and mental incompetence. She reached for another folder, this one containing evidence Margaret Goldberg had helped her gather. Victoria's bank records show deposits of exactly $420 monthly during the period when money was being withdrawn from my Social Security. Her mortgage payments, car payments, and credit card balances all show a lifestyle that exceeded her documented income from real estate sales. Dr. Webb's expression shifted slightly as he reviewed the financial evidence. This was not the confused rambling of an elderly woman losing her mental faculties. This was a systematic presentation of evidence by someone who understood exactly what had been done to her and how to prove it. Mrs. Miller, Sarah said, your daughter claims you've become increasingly paranoid and suspicious. She says you accused the entire family of conspiring against you. Because they are, Rachel replied. After I hired a lawyer to recover the stolen money, Patricia, Victoria, David, and Michael all called to pressure me into dropping the case. They threatened to cut off all family contact if I continued with legal action. Then Victoria filed a false report with your office claiming I'm mentally incompetent. That's a serious accusation, drive. Webb said. It's a serious crime, Rachel replied. Elder financial exploitation. Filing false reports to discredit the victim. Conspiracy to commit fraud. My lawyer has documentation for all of it. Sarah and Dr. Webb exchanged glances. This was clearly not what they'd expected to find. Instead of a confused elderly woman making paranoid accusations, they'd encountered someone who could present evidence, cite legal statutes, and explain complex financial crimes with clarity and precision. Let's talk about your daily functioning, drive. Webb said, changing tactics. How do you manage your medication? Rachel led them to her kitchen and showed them her pill organizer, filled with military precision for the week ahead. She explained her blood pressure monitoring routine, her diabetic testing schedule, her system for tracking medical appointments and prescription refills. I live independently because I maintain systems that keep me healthy and safe, she said. Victoria wants you to believe I'm incompetent because competent victims can fight back through legal channels. Incompetent victims get state guardians who can be pressured into settling cases quietly. Dr. Webb made notes as he toured her apartment. Clean, organized, well-maintained. Refrigerator stocked with appropriate food. Bills paid and filed systematically. No signs of neglect, confusion, or inability to manage basic life functions. Mrs. Miller, he said finally, based on this assessment, I see no evidence of cognitive impairment or inability to live independently. You've presented a coherent account of financial exploitation supported by documented evidence. Your living situation is appropriate and well-maintained. Sarah closed her folder. We'll be filing a report that finds no basis for protective intervention. Your daughter's concerns appear to be unfounded. After they left, Rachel sat in her living room and felt something she hadn't experienced in months: validation. Official recognition that she wasn't crazy, wasn't confused, wasn't making paranoid accusations against innocent family members. She was a crime victim whose family had tried to silence her by questioning her mental competence. But victory in the Adult Protective Services review was only the first step. The civil case against Victoria would take months or years to resolve. The criminal investigation that Margaret had suggested might never materialize. And the family relationships that had been destroyed by 12 years of theft and recent weeks of confrontation might never heal. Rachel walked to her bedroom and opened the top drawer of her dresser. Beneath the velvet jewelry box that held her pearls, she kept a small photo album. Pictures from better times: Victoria's college graduation, family Christmas dinners when Richard was alive. The vacation to San Diego where they'd bought the brown leather wallet. Victoria at age 25, bright with ambition and possibility. Victoria at 35, successful in her real estate career but still calling her mother every Sunday. Victoria at 42, buying the house in Paradise Valley with money that now seems suspicious in retrospect. When had the theft begun? When had her daughter stopped seeing her as a person to love and started seeing her as a resource to manage? Maybe it had been gradual, small withdrawals that grew into systematic exploitation over years of rationalization. Or maybe it had been calculated from the beginning, a long-term plan to extract money from an aging parent while maintaining the appearance of family loyalty. Rachel closed the photo album and returned it to the drawer. The woman in those pictures was gone, replaced by someone willing to destroy her mother's financial security for her own comfort. The family in those pictures was gone, revealed as a predatory unit that protected its interests by attacking the weakest member. But Rachel was still here. 77 years old, living alone, fighting for justice through legal systems designed to exhaust elderly plaintiffs before they could achieve resolution. She thought about Richard, about what he would say if he could see her now. He would be proud, she realized. Proud that she'd finally learned to fight for herself. Proud that she'd refused to be silently victimized by people who counted on her passivity and her fear of family conflict. The afternoon sun streamed through her living room windows, casting long shadows across the furniture she'd chosen carefully over 23 years. Each piece selected for durability and comfort rather than fashion. Like her life built to last, designed for security, maintained through careful choices and modest dreams. Victoria had tried to steal all of that. Not just the money, but the security and independence that money represented. The ability to live with dignity in her own space, to make her own decisions, to trust that her future was protected by her own careful planning. Some of it was gone forever. $60,000 couldn't be completely recovered even if she won the civil case. Trust in family couldn't be restored after systematic betrayal. The easy comfort of believing that love meant safety was lost for good. But what remained was more valuable than what had been taken. Strength she hadn't known she possessed. Legal knowledge she'd been forced to acquire. The understanding that she was capable of fighting for herself even when everyone she'd trusted turned against her. Rachel made herself dinner and ate it at her kitchen table, the same spot where she'd first read Victoria's invitation to the celebration dinner. That expensive piece of cream-colored paper was long gone, thrown away after the night when she'd learned the true cost of family inclusion. But the lesson remained. Some invitations weren't gifts. Some celebrations were actually punishments. Some families were actually predatory businesses that operated on the exploitation of their weakest members. The phone rang as she was washing her dishes. Margaret Goldberg's voice was crisp with professional satisfaction. The Adult Protective Services report came through. Complete exoneration. They found no evidence of mental impairment or need for protective intervention. In fact, they noted your exceptional clarity regarding complex financial matters and your well-maintained independent living situation. Good, Rachel said. More than good. This destroys Victoria's credibility and strengthens our civil case significantly. Juries don't like families who try to have their elderly relatives declared incompetent to avoid paying back stolen money. Rachel dried her hands and looked out her kitchen window. The Desert Palms community was settling into evening routine. Neighbors walking dogs, children playing in the fading light, families gathering around dinner tables in apartments much like her own. Normal life, conducted by people who probably trusted their relatives not to steal from them. Margaret, Rachel said, I want you to explore the criminal charges option. Are you sure? That's a hard road. Criminal cases are public, messy, potentially traumatic for everyone involved. They traumatized me for 12 years while they stole my money. Now it's their turn. The district attorney might not prosecute. Family financial exploitation cases are difficult, especially when the paperwork appears legitimate. Then we make it easy for them. We provide so much evidence that refusing to prosecute becomes harder than filing charges. Margaret was quiet for a moment. This isn't about the money anymore, is it? Rachel thought about the question. The money mattered, of course. $60,000 represented years of security, medical care, independence that had been stolen while she counted pills and watched her budget. But Margaret was right. This had become about something larger than financial restitution. It's about making sure they can't do this to anyone else, Rachel said. And it's about proving that elderly people don't have to be silent victims just because the criminals happen to be family. After she hung up, Rachel sat in her living room as darkness settled over Scottsdale. Somewhere in Paradise Valley, Victoria was probably working late on her real estate deals, living in the house. Purchased with money stolen from her mother's Social Security account. But tomorrow would bring new legal developments, additional evidence. Maybe even criminal charges that would finally hold her accountable for 12 years of systematic theft. Rachel had learned something important during these months of discovery and confrontation. Justice was possible, even for 77-year-old women whose families saw them as resources rather than people. It just required the willingness to fight for it, regardless of the cost. 6 months later, Dorothy Hayes walked into Margaret Goldberg's law office carrying a manila folder that would change everything. Dorothy was 82 years old, a retired social worker who'd spent 40 years investigating elder abuse cases before the term became widely recognized. She moved with the careful precision of someone whose mind remained sharp despite her body's increasing frailty. I read about Rachel Miller's case in the Arizona Republic, Dorothy said, settling into the chair across from Margaret's desk. I have information that might be helpful. Margaret looked up from the civil case files that had consumed her attention for months. The Miller case had become more complex than initially anticipated. Victoria's defense attorneys were skilled at creating delays, filing motions, requesting continuances. Meanwhile, Rachel's modest savings were slowly being consumed by legal fees that seemed to multiply faster than progress. What kind of information? Margaret asked. Dorothy opened her manila folder and spread its contents across Margaret's desk. Bank statements, credit card records, real estate documents, and what appeared to be copies of Social Security Administration paperwork. Victoria Chen Miller isn't just stealing from her mother, Dorothy said quietly. She's running a systematic elder financial exploitation operation. Margaret studied the documents with growing amazement. The paperwork showed at least 6 elderly individuals who'd had Family Financial Management Service deductions from their Social Security accounts. Monthly withdrawals ranging from $320 to $840, all processed through the same bank account that had been receiving Rachel's $420 payments. How did you get these? Margaret asked. I've been investigating elder abuse in the Paradise Valley area for 3 years, Dorothy said. Officially retired, but unofficially tracking patterns that local authorities weren't equipped to recognize. Victoria Chen Miller's name appeared in connection with multiple elderly clients who'd reported financial irregularities. Multiple clients? Real estate clients, mostly. Wealthy retirees looking to downsize, people dealing with estate issues after a spouse's death. Victoria would offer to help with the transition, handle paperwork, manage financial complications. Then she'd use the same representative authorization system she used on her mother. Margaret felt a familiar rush of prosecutorial excitement. This wasn't just a family dispute about money. This was organized crime targeting vulnerable elderly victims. How many victims total? At least 15 that I can document. Maybe twice that number if we include cases where the victims never realized they were being robbed. Dorothy pulled out another set of documents. Real estate records showing property purchases by Victoria and David Chen Miller. During the period when they were extracting money from multiple elderly accounts. Their lifestyle improvements correlate directly with the theft timeline. Margaret reviewed the real estate documents. The Paradise Valley house purchased in 2013, during the second year of systematic theft from Rachel's account. A vacation property in Sedona acquired in 2016. Luxury vehicle purchases, private school tuition for Victoria's children, country club memberships. All funded by money stolen from elderly Social Security recipients who trusted their real estate agent to help with financial transitions. This is federal crime territory, Margaret said. Wire fraud, conspiracy, organized financial exploitation. The FBI should be investigating this. The FBI is investigating this, Dorothy said with a thin smile. I brought the same evidence to them 6 weeks ago. They've opened a formal case file and designated Victoria Chen Miller as the primary target of a federal elder fraud investigation. Margaret sat back in her chair. Rachel's case had just transformed from a civil lawsuit into a supporting element in a major federal criminal investigation. Does Rachel know? Not yet. The FBI wanted to complete their preliminary investigation before contacting victims. But they're ready to move forward now. An hour later, Margaret sat in Rachel's living room explaining how her personal fight for justice had become part of a much larger criminal investigation. 15 other victims? Rachel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. At least 15 documented cases. The FBI believes there may be more who haven't come forward or haven't realized they were being robbed. Rachel walked to her kitchen window and stared out at the Desert Palms community. Somewhere in Paradise Valley, Victoria was conducting her real estate business meeting with elderly clients, offering to help with financial transitions that would secretly rob them of their life savings. How much money total? Over $2 million, based on the accounts Dorothy could trace. Victoria's been running this operation for 8 years, targeting elderly real estate clients and extracting money through the same representative authorization system she used on you. $2 million, Rachel repeated. The scale of the crime transformed everything Rachel had understood about her situation. She wasn't just a family member who'd been financially exploited by a daughter with money problems. She was one victim in a systematic criminal enterprise that targeted elderly people specifically because of their vulnerability and their tendency to trust authority figures offering help. The FBI wants to interview you next week, Margaret continued. Your case provides crucial evidence because you have the most complete documentation. And because Victoria's personal relationship to you establishes the predatory pattern they need to prove conspiracy charges. Rachel returned to her chair but didn't sit down. For 6 months, she'd been fighting what felt like a private battle against family members who'd betrayed her trust. The isolation had been almost overwhelming, fighting people she'd loved, defending herself against accusations of mental incompetence. Spending her modest savings on legal fees while everyone around her questioned her sanity. But she hadn't been crazy. She hadn't been alone. She'd been the first victim to fight back against a criminal operation that had been robbing elderly people for years, while hiding behind the respectability of a successful real estate business. What happens to the other victims? Rachel asked. The FBI will contact them as the investigation proceeds. Some may not have realized they were being robbed. Others may have noticed financial irregularities but assumed they were personal failures rather than criminal exploitation. Rachel thought about the shame she'd felt when she first discovered the unauthorized withdrawals. The self-doubt, the assumption that she must have forgotten authorizing something, the reluctance to question family members who claimed to be helping her. How many other elderly people were sitting in apartments like hers, staring at financial statements they didn't understand? trusting people who were systematically robbing them. I want to help, Rachel said. Help with what? The investigation, the other victims. Whatever I can do to make sure Victoria and everyone involved in this gets prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Margaret studied Rachel's expression. The frightened, isolated elderly woman who'd first walked into her office 6 months ago was gone. In her place sat someone who understood exactly what she'd been fighting and why it mattered beyond her personal situation. The FBI agent handling the case is named David Murphy. He's experienced with elder fraud investigations, and he specifically requested to interview you because of the quality of evidence you've maintained. When? Tuesday morning. Are you prepared for how intensive this might become? Federal criminal cases move slowly, require extensive testimony, involve publicity that could be uncomfortable. Rachel looked around her living room, at the life she'd built through careful choices and modest dreams. 6 months ago, she would have been terrified by the prospect of federal investigations and public attention. She would have worried about family disapproval, community judgment, the disruption to her quiet routine. But that woman had been destroyed by systematic betrayal and replaced by someone who understood that justice required courage even when courage felt impossible. I'm prepared, Rachel said. Special Agent David Murphy arrived at Rachel's apartment on Tuesday morning carrying a briefcase full of evidence and a digital recorder for formal testimony. He was younger than Rachel had expected, maybe 45. With the quiet intensity of someone who'd spent years investigating crimes against vulnerable populations. Mrs. Miller, I want to start by thanking you for your cooperation with this investigation. Your documentation and willingness to pursue legal action provided the foundation for uncovering a much larger criminal operation. Rachel served coffee and arranged her own evidence files on the kitchen table. 6 months of fighting had taught her to be prepared, organized, systematic in presenting information that supported her case. How many total victims are we talking about? She asked. 23 that we can definitively connect to Victoria Chen Miller's operation. But the pattern suggests there may be dozens more who never realized they were being robbed or who were too ashamed to report financial irregularities. Agent Murphy spread photographs across the table. Real estate documents, bank records, surveillance photos of Victoria meeting with elderly clients, copies of the fraudulent representative authorization forms. The operation was sophisticated, he continued. Victoria would identify elderly clients going through transitions, selling homes, dealing with estate issues, managing medical expenses. She'd offer financial assistance as part of her real estate services. Then use the representative authorization system to gain access to their Social Security accounts. Always the same amount? Rachel asked. No. The withdrawals were calibrated based on each victim's benefit levels and spending patterns. $420 for you, $320 for some others, up to $840 for victims with higher benefit amounts. Always designed to avoid suspicion while maximizing extraction over time. Rachel studied the photographs of other victims. Elderly men and women who looked like her neighbors, her friends, people who'd worked their entire lives to achieve modest security in retirement. All of them systematically robbed by someone they'd trusted to help with financial complications. What happens to Victoria now? Federal indictment on 15 counts including wire fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, money laundering, and filing false documents. She'll be arrested tomorrow morning at her office. David Chen Miller faces similar charges as a co-conspirator. And the money? Asset forfeiture. The Paradise Valley house, the Sedona property, vehicles, business accounts, everything purchased with money stolen from elderly victims. It will be liquidated and distributed as restitution to identified victims. Agent Murphy opened his digital recorder. Now I need your formal statement about how the crimes began, how you discovered them, and what impact they've had on your life. This testimony will be crucial for establishing the criminal pattern and the harm caused to victims. For the next 3 hours, Rachel told her story in detail. The grief after Richard's death, Victoria's offer to help with paperwork. The gradual realization that help had become systematic theft, the family's attempts to discredit her when she fought back. As she spoke, Rachel realized that her story had become something larger than personal victimization. It was evidence of how criminal enterprises targeted elderly people, How they used family relationships and professional authority to overcome victims' natural caution. How they relied on shame and isolation to prevent reporting. But it was also evidence that elderly victims could fight back, could document crimes, could pursue justice through legal channels. Even when everyone around them suggested they were too old or too confused to understand what had really happened. Mrs. Miller, Agent Murphy said as he packed up his recording equipment, "I want you to know that your case is going to help a lot of people. The evidence you've gathered and your willingness to pursue prosecution despite family pressure has been essential to uncovering this criminal operation." After he left, Rachel sat in her living room and tried to absorb what she'd learned. Victoria's crimes weren't personal failures or family conflicts. They were part of an organized criminal enterprise that had stolen over $2 million from elderly victims across Arizona. Tomorrow, Victoria would be arrested at her real estate office in full view of colleagues and clients. Her house would be seized, her bank accounts frozen, her professional reputation destroyed by federal charges that could result in decades of prison time. The daughter who'd stolen $60,000 from her mother, while watching her struggle with basic expenses, would finally face consequences proportional to her crimes. But as Rachel prepared for bed that night, she realized that justice hadn't brought the satisfaction she'd expected. Vindication felt less like triumph than like exhaustion mixed with profound sadness for the family relationships that had been destroyed by systematic betrayal. She thought about the other victims Agent Murphy had described. Elderly people like herself who'd been robbed by someone they trusted, isolated by shame. Convinced they were too confused or incompetent to understand their own financial affairs. How many of them were still sitting in apartments tonight, staring at statements they didn't understand? Trusting people who were systematically destroying their security? Rachel made herself a cup of tea and sat at her kitchen table. The same spot where she'd first read Victoria's invitation to the celebration dinner that had cost her nearly $4,000 and revealed the truth about her family's criminal operation. Tomorrow would bring news reports, community attention. Probably more attempts by Victoria's family to portray her as a confused elderly woman making malicious accusations. But tonight, for the first time in 8 months, Rachel felt something approaching peace. Not because justice had been achieved, but because she'd fought for it despite overwhelming pressure to remain silent. Because she'd refused to be a victim even when fighting back seemed impossible. Because she'd learned that elderly people didn't have to accept abuse just because the abusers happened to be family. The federal investigation would continue for months or years. The criminal trial would require extensive testimony that might be traumatic and exhausting. The civil case would eventually result in some financial recovery, though probably less than the full amount stolen. But the most important victory had already been won. Rachel had refused to disappear quietly while criminals profited from her victimization. She'd documented crimes, pursued legal action, and provided evidence that would prevent future victims from suffering the same exploitation. At 77 years old, living alone in a modest apartment, she'd taken on a criminal operation backed by professional expertise and family influence. And she'd won. The desert night stretched endlessly beyond her windows, vast and unforgiving to those who didn't understand how to survive it. But Rachel had learned the most important lesson of desert survival: sometimes the harshest conditions produce the strongest forms of life. The arrest happened exactly as Agent Murphy had predicted. Victoria Chen Miller was taken into custody at her Paradise Valley real estate office at 9:47 a.m. on a Wednesday morning, in front of colleagues, clients, and a local news crew that had been tipped off about the federal elder fraud investigation. Rachel watched the coverage from her living room, feeling a mixture of vindication and sorrow as she saw her daughter in handcuffs being led to a federal police vehicle. The woman on the television screen bore little resemblance to the child she'd raised, the ambitious young professional she'd once been proud of, or even the calculating criminal she'd revealed herself to be. She looked smaller somehow, diminished by the reality of consequences she'd probably never imagined facing. The news coverage was extensive and damning. Multi-million-dollar elder fraud ring dismantled, read the headline in the Arizona Republic. The accompanying article detailed Victoria's systematic targeting of elderly real estate clients. The sophisticated authorization system she'd used to steal from Social Security accounts, and the lifestyle of luxury she'd funded through the systematic robbery of vulnerable retirees. Rachel's phone started ringing at 10 o'clock. Reporters wanting statements from the primary victim whose case had triggered the federal investigation. Neighbors expressing shock that Mrs. Miller's family troubles had turned out to be part of a major criminal enterprise. Margaret Goldberg calling with updates on the rapid legal developments now unfolding. But the call that mattered most came at noon. "Mrs. Miller? This is Dorothy Hayes. We met briefly at the lawyer's office. I wanted to thank you personally for your courage in pursuing this case." Rachel remembered Dorothy clearly, the retired social worker whose investigation had uncovered the full scope of Victoria's criminal operation. "I should be thanking you," Rachel replied. "You're the one who proved this was bigger than just family financial abuse. But you're the one who documented everything and refused to be silenced when they tried to have you declared incompetent. Without your evidence and testimony, Victoria would still be operating and stealing from new victims." Dorothy's words carried weight that Rachel was still learning to accept. For months, she'd felt like an isolated elderly woman, fighting a hopeless battle against people with more resources, more connections, more power than she possessed. The transformation of her private struggle into a federal criminal case still felt surreal. "The other victims," Rachel said. "Are they all right?" "Most of them never realized they were being robbed. The FBI is contacting them systematically as the investigation proceeds. Some are relieved to finally understand why their financial situation seemed more difficult than expected. Others are struggling with the same feelings of betrayal and self-doubt you experienced." Rachel thought about those other victims, elderly people discovering that someone they'd trusted had systematically stolen from them for years. The shame, the isolation, the questions about their own judgment and competence. "Is there anything I can do to help them?" Dorothy was quiet for a moment. "Actually, there is. Agent Murphy mentioned that you might be willing to speak with other victims, share your experience of fighting back and pursuing justice. Some of them are where you were 8 months ago, confused, isolated, convinced they're too old to effectively challenge what's been done to them." "Of course," Rachel said immediately. "Whatever I can do." That afternoon, Rachel found herself in an unexpected role. Agent Murphy arranged a meeting at the FBI field office in Phoenix, where 3 other victims of Victoria's operation had agreed to discuss their experiences and learn about legal options for recovery. Eleanor Santos, 73, had been robbed of $38,000 over 4 years through Victoria's representative authorization system. Frank Morrison, 81, had lost $45,000 during a 5-year period when Victoria was supposedly helping him manage assets after his wife's death. Marie Chen, no relation to Victoria despite the shared surname, had been systematically robbed of $52,000 while Victoria assisted with her relocation from California to Arizona. All of them shared the same story of trusting a professional who offered help during vulnerable transitions, signing paperwork they didn't fully understand. Then watching their financial security erode while being told they were managing their own affairs poorly. "I thought I was getting confused about money," Eleanor said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My social security seemed lower than I remembered, but Victoria explained that costs had increased and I was probably misremembering the amounts. She made me feel stupid for questioning anything," Frank added. Said elderly people often become paranoid about finances and start making accusations against people trying to help them. Rachel recognized the manipulation techniques immediately. The systematic undermining of victims' confidence in their own judgment, the suggestion that questioning authority figures was evidence of age-related decline. The isolation that prevented victims from seeking outside verification of what was happening to them. "You weren't stupid," Rachel said firmly. "You were targeted by someone who understood how to exploit trust and vulnerability. The crime was in her deception, not in your willingness to accept help during difficult transitions." Agent Murphy facilitated the discussion, explaining the federal charges against Victoria, the asset forfeiture process that would provide restitution to victims, and the importance of victim impact statements in determining appropriate sentencing. But Rachel found herself addressing questions that went beyond legal procedures. How had she found the courage to challenge family members? How had she maintained determination when everyone around her suggested she was confused or making false accusations? How had she survived the isolation of fighting people she'd loved and trusted? I realized that staying silent wouldn't protect the relationships I thought I was preserving, Rachel said. Victoria had already destroyed those relationships when she decided to steal from me. I was just acknowledging reality instead of pretending that theft was somehow an expression of family loyalty. Marie Chen nodded slowly. I keep wondering if I should have known, if there were signs I missed. The signs were hidden deliberately, Rachel replied. These weren't crimes of opportunity. They were systematic operations designed to avoid detection by people who had every reason to trust the criminal. Frank Morrison looked around the conference room, at the federal agents. The legal documents, the evidence boards displaying the scope of Victoria's criminal enterprise. 8 months ago, did you ever imagine it would lead to this? He asked Rachel. Rachel thought about the question. 8 months ago, she'd been an isolated elderly woman, discovering unauthorized deductions from her Social Security account, convinced she'd somehow authorized financial services she didn't remember. She'd been ashamed, confused, reluctant to challenge authority figures who claimed to be helping her. 8 months ago, I was convinced I was too old and too confused to understand my own finances, she said. Victoria counted on that self-doubt. She counted on my reluctance to question family members. My fear of appearing incompetent, my isolation from people who might have helped me understand what was really happening. What changed? Eleanor asked. I got angry, Rachel said simply. Not just at the theft, but at the assumption that elderly people should accept abuse silently. Because we're supposedly too fragile or too confused to fight back. That assumption is what allows these crimes to continue. Agent Murphy made notes as the victims shared their experiences and questions. Their testimony would be crucial for establishing the scope of Victoria's operation. The harm inflicted on individual victims, and the sophisticated techniques used to avoid detection and discourage reporting. But Rachel realized that something more important was happening in this conference room. Elderly people who'd been isolated by crime were connecting with others who'd shared similar experiences. Victims who'd been convinced they were uniquely vulnerable or incompetent were learning that they'd been targeted by sophisticated criminals who specialized in exploiting trust during difficult life transitions. Mrs. Miller, Agent Murphy said as the meeting concluded, would you be willing to participate in a victim impact panel when this case goes to trial? Your story of fighting back despite family pressure has been important for other victims. Of course, Rachel said. Eleanor Santos approached her as they gathered their papers. Would it be all right if I called you sometime? To talk about how to handle the family reactions to all this? Rachel thought about the isolation she'd experienced. When Victoria and Patricia had threatened to cut off all family contact if she continued pursuing legal action. The loneliness of fighting people she'd loved, the community suspicion when neighbors heard rumors about family conflicts. The months of wondering if she was making terrible mistakes by refusing to accept abuse quietly. Please do call, Rachel said, handing Eleanor her phone number. Fighting back is the right choice, but it's not always easy to maintain that conviction when everyone around you suggests you should just accept what happened and move on. The drive home from Phoenix took Rachel through neighborhoods she'd traveled for decades. But everything looked different now. She was no longer just an elderly woman living independently in a retirement community. She was a federal crime victim whose courage in fighting back had helped uncover a criminal operation that had stolen over $2 million from elderly people across Arizona. That evening, Rachel received another call from Margaret Goldberg with updates on the rapidly developing civil case. The federal asset forfeiture is proceeding faster than expected, Margaret said. Victoria's properties, vehicles, and business accounts have been frozen. Preliminary estimates suggest you'll recover about 70% of the money stolen from you, possibly more depending on the final liquidation values. What about the other victims? Full restitution for everyone. The federal prosecutor is treating this as a priority case because of the vulnerability of the victim population and the sophistication of the criminal operation. Rachel sat at her kitchen table, the same spot where she'd read Victoria's invitation to the celebration dinner that had revealed the truth about her family's attitude toward her. 9 months ago, she'd paid nearly $4,000 for the privilege of being humiliated by people who'd been systematically robbing her for years. Now those same people were facing federal charges, asset forfeiture, and prison sentences that reflected the seriousness of their crimes against elderly victims. But as Rachel prepared for bed that night, she realized that the most important victory hadn't been achieved in federal court. It had been achieved in her own mind, when she decided that being elderly didn't mean accepting abuse silently, that family relationships weren't worth preserving when they were built on exploitation, and that justice was worth fighting for regardless of the personal cost. The phone rang one more time before she went to sleep. Dorothy Hayes, calling with news that another elderly victim had come forward after seeing the television coverage of Victoria's arrest. 86-year-old woman in Tempe, Dorothy said. Victoria helped her with estate issues after her husband died 3 years ago. She's been missing about $30,000 from her accounts but assumed she'd forgotten about authorized expenses. What happens now? Same process. FBI interview, documentation, addition to the federal case. But she specifically asked if she could talk to you about how to handle the emotional aspects of discovering that family-type relationships had been used to exploit her. Rachel looked around her apartment, at the life she'd rebuilt through careful choices and determined independence. Tomorrow would bring another conversation with an elderly crime victim, another opportunity to demonstrate that fighting back was possible, even when the criminals were people who'd claimed to care about their victims. Give her my number, Rachel said. And Dorothy? Thank you for everything you've done to help us understand what really happened to us. Thank you for being the first victim brave enough to fight back. Without your courage, Victoria would still be stealing from elderly people. And we'd still be treating these cases as family disputes rather than organized crime. After she hung up, Rachel made herself a cup of tea and sat in her living room. Outside, the Arizona night was clear and vast, full of the kind of beauty that emerged from harsh conditions and careful survival. In 6 months, she would testify at Victoria's federal trial. She would stand before a judge and jury and explain how systematic financial exploitation had nearly destroyed her independence and security. She would describe the isolation, the self-doubt, the family pressure to remain silent about crimes that had been disguised as helpful assistance. But she would also describe fighting back, documenting evidence, pursuing legal action, refusing to accept that elderly people should be grateful for whatever treatment their families chose to provide. The trial would determine Victoria's sentence, but the most important judgment had already been rendered. Elderly people could fight back against exploitation, could document crimes, could pursue justice through legal channels, even when everyone around them suggested they were too old or too confused to understand what had really happened. Rachel finished her tea and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new victims to counsel, new evidence to review for the ongoing federal investigation. But tonight, she could rest knowing that her decision to fight back had protected future victims and demonstrated that age didn't automatically mean vulnerability, that family authority didn't excuse criminal behavior, and that justice was possible for elderly people who refused to be silently victimized. The desert night stretched endlessly beyond her windows, vast and unforgiving but filled with life that had learned to thrive in difficult conditions. Rachel had learned the same lesson. 1 year later, Rachel Miller stood at the podium in Courtroom 4 of the Sandra Day O'Connor Federal Courthouse in Phoenix, preparing to deliver her victim impact statement at Victoria Chen Miller's sentencing hearing. The courtroom was fuller than she'd expected. Other victims and their family members occupied the first 2 rows. Federal agents who'd worked the case sat behind the prosecutor's table. Local media representatives filled several additional rows, documenting the conclusion of Arizona's largest elder financial exploitation case in recent history. Victoria sat at the defendant's table wearing an Orange County Jail uniform, her hands folded carefully in her lap. She'd been in custody for 6 months since pleading guilty to 15 federal charges, in exchange for cooperation with ongoing investigations of similar crimes in other states. The woman who'd once commanded real estate deals worth millions of dollars now faced a sentencing range of 12 to 20 years in federal prison. Your Honor, Rachel began, her voice clear and steady, my name is Rachel Miller, and I am 78 years old. Victoria Chen Miller is my daughter. She'd rehearsed these words for weeks, working with Margaret Goldberg and victim advocates to craft a statement that conveyed both the personal impact of Victoria's crimes and their broader significance for elderly people throughout the community. For 12 years, my daughter systematically stole money from my Social Security account while convincing me that I was too confused to manage my own finances. She took $60,000 that represented my security, my independence, and my ability to live with dignity in my own home. Rachel looked directly at Victoria, who kept her eyes focused on her folded hands. But the theft of money was only part of what she took from me. She stole my trust in family relationships. She stole my confidence in my own judgment. She stole years when I denied myself basic comforts because I believed I couldn't afford them, while she was using my money to fund a lifestyle of luxury. The courtroom was completely silent except for the soft sounds of court reporters and the air conditioning system. When I discovered the unauthorized withdrawals and tried to confront her about them, Victoria attempted to have me declared mentally incompetent. She filed false reports claiming I was paranoid and confused, hoping that destroying my credibility would prevent me from pursuing legal action against her. Rachel paused and glanced around the courtroom. Eleanor Santos, Frank Morrison, and Marie Chen were sitting in the front row, along with 6 other victims whose cases had been connected to Victoria's operation during the federal investigation. I learned that I was not alone. Victoria had targeted at least 23 elderly people, stealing over $2 million from Social Security accounts while disguising her crimes as helpful financial management services. She specialized in approaching elderly people during vulnerable moments after the death of a spouse, during medical crises, while dealing with estate complications and using those moments of weakness to gain unauthorized access to their financial accounts. Judge Patricia Williams leaned forward slightly, her expression reflecting both attention and gravity as Rachel continued. The impact of these crimes extends far beyond the money stolen. Victoria's operation was designed to isolate victims, undermine their confidence, and prevent them from seeking help or questioning what was happening to them. Elderly people who discovered financial irregularities were told they were becoming confused, were making false accusations, were being ungrateful toward family members trying to help them. Rachel thought about the months of self-doubt, the nights when she'd questioned her own memory and judgment, the isolation, when family members threatened to abandon her if she continued pursuing legal action. This systematic undermining of elderly people's confidence in their own competence is perhaps more damaging than the financial theft itself. It prevents victims from fighting back, from seeking help, from understanding that what's happening to them is criminal, rather than evidence of their own declining abilities. Victoria's defense attorney, a young man who'd spent months arguing for reduced charges based on family dysfunction, rather than criminal intent, shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Your Honor, I want you to understand that fighting back against these crimes required me to challenge not just my daughter, but an entire system that assumes elderly people should be grateful for whatever treatment their families choose to provide. I had to overcome the assumption that family conflict should be resolved privately, that elderly people who make accusations against relatives are probably confused or vindictive." Rachel's voice grew stronger as she addressed the broader implications of Victoria's crimes. Elderly financial exploitation succeeds because it operates in isolation, targeting people who are unlikely to have advocates, unlikely to understand complex financial systems, and unlikely to be believed when they report abuse by family members or trusted professionals. Victoria counted on my shame, my isolation, and my reluctance to challenge family authority. She looked directly at Judge Williams. "But elderly people can fight back. We can document evidence, pursue legal action, and achieve justice through appropriate legal channels. The assumption that we are too frail, too confused, or too dependent on family approval to effectively challenge criminal behavior is exactly what allows these crimes to continue." Rachel concluded her statement with words she'd written and rewritten dozens of times. Victoria's crimes didn't just harm individual victims. They harmed the entire community of elderly people by reinforcing stereotypes about our vulnerability and incompetence. Every elderly person who suffers financial abuse and remains silent contributes to the assumption that we are acceptable targets for exploitation. She gathered her notes and prepared to return to her seat. I ask this court to impose a sentence that reflects not just the financial harm caused to individual victims, but the broader harm caused to elderly people throughout our community who must now question whether they can trust family members, professional service providers, and others who offer assistance during vulnerable moments in their lives. Judge Williams thanked Rachel for her statement and called for a brief recess before announcing the sentence. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Rachel found herself surrounded by other victims, FBI agents, and victim advocates who'd supported her throughout the lengthy legal process. "That was incredibly powerful," said Eleanor Santos. "I never could have spoken like that when this first started." "None of us could," Rachel replied. "But we learned that our voices mattered, that our experiences were evidence of serious crimes rather than personal failures." Agent Murphy approached with final updates on the asset recovery process. "Complete restitution for all identified victims," he said. "Victoria's properties, vehicles, and business accounts have been liquidated. You'll receive a check for the full $60,000 within 30 days. The money was important, of course. It represented security, independence, the ability to live without fear of financial emergencies." But as Rachel listened to Agent Murphy discuss the details of asset distribution, she realized that the money had become secondary to something more valuable. For the first time in 78 years, she understood her own strength. When court reconvened, Judge Williams delivered a sentence that reflected the serious nature of Victoria's crimes. 18 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Complete restitution to all victims. Prohibition from working in financial services or real estate upon release. Victoria stood to receive her sentence with the same composed expression she'd maintained throughout the legal proceedings. She offered no apology to victims, no acknowledgement of responsibility beyond what had been required for her guilty plea. As federal marshals prepared to escort Victoria from the courtroom, she turned briefly toward the victim section. Her eyes found Rachel's for just a moment, and something passed between them that might have been recognition. Regret, or simply acknowledgement that their relationship had been permanently transformed by the choices Victoria had made. Then she was gone, led away to begin serving a sentence that would keep her in federal prison until she was nearly 60 years old. Outside the courthouse, Rachel stood in the Arizona sunshine with other victims who'd become friends during the long legal process. They exchanged phone numbers, made plans for occasional lunches, promised to stay in touch as they rebuilt their lives with recovered funds and hard-won wisdom about protecting themselves from future exploitation. "What will you do now?" Marie Chen asked. Rachel thought about the question. For 15 months, her life had been consumed by legal proceedings. Victim interviews, testimony preparation, and the complex emotional work of processing systematic betrayal by family members she'd trusted and loved. "I'm going to live," she said simply. The answer encompassed more than she could easily explain. Living meant returning to the careful routines that had sustained her independence for decades, but with new knowledge about her own resilience and capability. Living meant staying connected to the community of elderly crime victims who'd supported each other through the legal process. Living meant continuing to speak out about elder financial exploitation, helping other victims understand that fighting back was possible regardless of age or family pressure. Most importantly, living meant accepting that at 78 years old, she'd learned something crucial about herself that she'd never known before. She was stronger than she'd imagined, braver than circumstances had required her to be, and capable of fighting for justice even when the cost seemed overwhelming. The drive home to Scottsdale took Rachel through familiar neighborhoods that looked exactly the same as they had 2 years earlier. But everything fundamental had changed. She was no longer just an elderly woman living quietly in a retirement community, grateful for whatever inclusion her family chose to provide. She was someone who'd fought a criminal organization and won. Someone who'd documented evidence, pursued legal action, and achieved justice through appropriate legal channels. Someone who'd refused to be silently victimized and had protected future victims by holding criminals accountable for their actions. Back in her apartment, Rachel made tea and sat at her kitchen table. The same spot where she'd read Victoria's invitation to the celebration dinner that had cost her nearly $4,000. And revealed the truth about her family's criminal operation. The same spot where she'd discovered unauthorized Social Security deductions and made the decision to fight back despite overwhelming pressure to remain silent. A year later, the table held different paperwork. Restitution checks that had restored her financial security. Letters from other elderly victims who'd been inspired to report similar crimes. Invitations to speak at community organizations about preventing elder financial exploitation. The phone rang as she was organizing the day's mail. Dorothy Hayes, calling with news about expanded federal investigations into elder fraud operations in California and Nevada. Your case has become a model for how these investigations should be conducted, Dorothy said. The evidence collection methods, the victim support systems, the prosecution strategies, it's all being replicated in other jurisdictions. What about new victims? Rachel asked. Reports are up 300% nationwide. Elderly people who might have remained silent about financial abuse are coming forward because they've seen that fighting back is possible. Rachel finished her tea as the Arizona sun set beyond her kitchen window. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to help other victims, new chances to demonstrate that elderly people didn't have to accept abuse silently. New ways to contribute to communities that had supported her through the most difficult period of her life. But tonight, she could rest knowing that her decision to fight back had achieved everything she'd hoped for and more than she'd dared to imagine. The money was recovered. The criminals were imprisoned. Future victims were protected by expanded investigations and increased public awareness. Most importantly, she'd proven to herself and to everyone who doubted her that age didn't automatically mean vulnerability, that family authority didn't excuse criminal behavior. And that justice was possible for elderly people who refused to be quietly victimized. Life doesn't end just because it breaks once. What falls apart can be the very place where we learn to stand again. Rachel had learned to stand in ways she'd never imagined necessary. She'd discovered strength that came not from avoiding difficult situations, but from facing them with courage and determination. She'd found community among people who'd shared similar experiences of betrayal and recovery. If this story gave even a small moment of strength to someone out there, then everything I went through means something today. The letters from other elderly victims, the phone calls from people who'd been inspired to report financial abuse, the invitations to speak about prevention and recovery, all of it suggested that her story had meaning beyond personal vindication. If this resonated with you, please like and subscribe, and share a piece of your own story in the comments below. Your words might become the seed of the next chapter we create together. At 78 years old, Rachel had learned that her voice mattered, that her experiences were valuable, that her courage could inspire others facing similar challenges. The isolated elderly woman who'd been afraid to challenge family authority had become someone whose story helped other victims understand that fighting back was possible. Thank you for spending this time with me. The desert night settled over Scottsdale with the kind of beauty that emerged from harsh conditions and patient survival. Rachel prepared for bed knowing that tomorrow would bring new opportunities to live fully, to help others, to continue growing into the person she'd learned she could become. Outside her window, the stars appeared one by one in the vast Arizona sky. Infinite and enduring and filled with the same light that had guided travelers through difficult journeys for thousands of years. Rachel had completed her own difficult journey from victim to survivor to advocate. Now she could rest knowing that her courage had protected others, and that her story would continue to provide hope for elderly people who needed to understand that fighting back was possible, regardless of age or circumstance. The woman who'd paid nearly $4,000 for dinner without protest was gone forever. In her place was someone who understood her own worth, her own strength, and her own capacity to demand justice even when justice seemed impossible to achieve. At 78 years old, Rachel Miller had learned the most important lesson of her life: she was worthy of respect, protection, and love, and she was capable of fighting